Boys and girls, today we're going to be reading Rosa Parks and the Montgomery Bus Boycott. We are focusing this week on central ideas, which is the main overall big idea that the author is trying to convey. And you do that by pulling out details from the text. So let's read from Commonlit, Rosa Parks and the Montgomery Bus Boycott. The civil rights movement was a social movement that began in the mid-1950s and lasted until approximately 1968. This movement fought to end racial segregation and discrimination against African Americans in the United States. The small moments of resistance by ordinary citizens is what created the foundation for this revolution. As you read, take notes on how civil rights activists were able to create change and how others resisted these positive changes. So as we read, we'll take notes and take little pieces of details out about how Rosa Parks was able to create change just by staying seated on a bus. On a cold December evening in 1955, Rosa Parks quietly incited a revolution just by sitting down. She was tired after spending a day at work at a department store seamstress. She stepped onto the bus for the ride home and sat in the fifth row, the first row of the colored section. So right here, let's take a look. The first row of the colored section. I want to highlight things that I find are really important, okay? So details that are there. And why is that very important for us? Because the bus was separated by people's skin color. The back of the bus was for, quote unquote, as the text says, the colored section. Let me make sure my grammar is complete there. Okay. In Montgomery, Alabama, when a bus became full, the seats nearer the front were given to white passengers. So as we can see by my text note there, this is maybe something that we can highlight. Okay. So make sure that that is highlighted. So let me try that one more time. And it's underlined in Commonlit. The Montgomery bus driver, James Blake, ordered Parks and 3 other African Americans seated nearby to move. Move, y'all. I want those 2 seats to the back of the bus. So James Blake, right here, obviously he's the bus driver, and he ordered Parks and 3 other Africans to move. What do you think of James Blake at this time? Knowing that he wants them to move and he feels that he's following, how do you think Rosa Parks is thinking about him, or the people, the African Americans that are seated? 3 riders complied, but Parks did not. So basically they're saying right here, it's really important. She did not move, but the other riders did. She was making a statement. Okay. So the other ones complied and did what they did, but she didn't want to at that point. The following excerpt of what happened next is from Douglas Brinkley's 2000 Rosa Parks biography. Are you going to stand up? The driver demanded. Rosa Parks looked straight at him and said, no. Flustered and not quite sure what to do, Blake retorted, well, I'm going to have you arrested. And Parks, still sitting next to the window, replied softly, you may do that. I want you to think about the way they interacted with each other right here. Do you see this word flustered? You can see that the bus driver was impatient. Did not seem like a very nice man. But if you look at the way Rosa Parks responded, she just said no, and you may do that. Which was very interesting. She was not angry. She calmly stated her point to him. He said she was going to have her arrested. It doesn't seem like that influenced her. Having her arrested did not influence her decision. After Parks refused to move, she was arrested and fined $10. Now, boys and girls, you should know at that time, $10 was expensive. We have a different economic and money way today than they did then. The chain of events triggered by her arrest changed the United States. King, Abernathy, Boycott, and the SCLC. Now, if you guys look here, this is a subtitle. Subtitles, of course, as we all know, separate sections. So everything in this section will be talking about King, Abernathy, Boycott, and the SCLC. So what Rosa Parks did on that bus and being arrested for not moving, it got around. It changed things. People were inspired, and people saw that it can happen. At that time, a little-known minister named Martin Luther King Jr., we always want to make sure that we take note of who, just like we did the who, what, where, when, and how, who is in your story or who are they mentioning, had recently become the leader within the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. Born and educated in Atlanta, that's Atlanta, Georgia, in the South, King studied the writings and practices of Henry David Thoreau and Mahatma Gandhi. Their teaching advocated. Let's take a look at the word advocate. Advocate means to publicly recommend or support. So his teaching supported civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance to social injustice. Okay. Civil disobedience is if I look here and I tap on my number here, is the refusal to follow certain laws as a peaceful form of protest. Boys and girls, we are allowed to protest here in the United States, but it must be peaceful. It must be non-violent. Okay? So they were not using, was Rosa Parks, when she sat on the bus, was she violent in any way? No, she was using non-violent means. She just said no and did not move. My highlights. There we go. My highlights. I'm finally figuring it out now, guys. A staunch, and let's look at the word staunch, loyal, devotee of nonviolence. So he was very much about nonviolence. King and his colleague, Ralph Abernathy, organized a boycott of the Montgomery buses. Let's take a look. Boycott is refusing to buy or deal with a person, an organization, or a country as a form of protest. So boycott is a very important word for talking about Rosa Parks and everything she did, because that got everybody, because she did it, a chain reaction came that everybody decided not to ride the buses. What kind of effect do you think that would have on the bus companies about the money, about the way of life at that time, about the perspectives of people that are white and that were at the time called colored? The demands that were made were simple. Black passengers should be treated with courtesy. Seating should be allotted on a first-come, first-served basis, with white passengers sitting from front to back and black passengers sitting from back to front. And the African American drivers should drive routes that primarily serviced African Americans. On Monday, December 5th, 1955, the boycott went into effect. So those were the demands. What were some of the things they wanted? They wanted allotted to become on a first come, first served seating basis. Okay, there's one. I might, is it not? Oh, there it goes. White passengers sitting from front to back and black passengers sitting from back to front. That was the demands they made. And you know what? They seemed pretty reasonable, didn't they? Montgomery officials stopped at nothing in attempting to sabotage the boycott. Sabotage meaning to stop the boycott and do things out of means to do that. King and Abernathy were arrested. Violence began during the action and continued after its conclusion. 4 churches, as well as the homes of King and Abernathy, were bombed. So after this, as we can see, a reaction or an effect due to this was people were bombing the homes of other human beings. And still, the boycott continued. They still believed so much in the right for this freedom and this equality that they persevered through this and continued even though they were facing violence against them. King and Abernathy's organization, the Montgomery Improvement Association, had hoped for 50% support rate among African Americans, so they wanted at least 50% of the people to be able to help them. To their surprise and delight, over 90% of the city's African Americans refused to ride the buses. So think about what Rosa Parks did here. Because of her sitting down, look at all the effects that happened. Let's go back. They began with making demands for first come, first served basis. Homes were bombed, but they still continued to boycott. 90% of the city's African Americans refused to ride the buses, all because one woman said, "No, I'm not going to move today." Let's go back to the text. People walked to work or rode their bikes in carpools, which were established to help the elderly. The bus companies suffered thousands of dollars. So look at this effect that happened. Thousands of dollars in revenue. They lost money, which was very important. Finally, on November 23rd, 1956, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of MIA. That's really important. The Supreme Court ruled that what they were saying and what they were asking for can happen. Segregated, and let's look at the word segregated, to separate groups of people based on race and religion. Remember, during this time, they separated people by the color of their skin in schools, water fountains, even on these buses. Busing was declared unconstitutional. City officials reluctantly agreed to comply with the court ruling. They didn't want to do it, but they knew they had to. The Black community of Montgomery had held firm in their resolve. Let's look at the word resolve. They determined to do something. They were firm in that. In the aftermath of the boycott, King said, "We came to see that in the long run, it is more honorable to walk in dignity than to ride in humiliation." The quality of being worthy of honor, respect. So we decided to substitute tired feet for tired souls and walk the streets of Montgomery. I love this. More honorable to walk in dignity than ride in humiliation. Basically, what is he saying there? He's saying that they would rather stand for their beliefs than give into something that violates their beliefs, that goes against their beliefs. The Montgomery bus boycott triggered a firestorm in the South. Across the region, Blacks resisted moving to the back of the bus. Similar actions flared up in other cities. So, again, go back to Rosa Parks in the very beginning. Just by saying no, but by not moving herself in that. Look at the wind and the chain of reaction and the effects it had, not only in that area, but now it is moving across the country. The boycott put Martin Luther King in the national spotlight. He became the acknowledged leader of the nascent, which is the beginning to develop and showing signs of future potential, civil rights movement, which eventually he did. With Ralph Abernathy, King formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This organization was dedicated to fighting Jim Crow segregation. Let's take a look at what Jim Crow is again. Jim Crow refers to the state and local laws enforcing racial segregation in southern United States. So all the laws that they said that they could be separated and segregated, like in schools and water fountains and many, many, many other places, they all were under what you call Jim Crow laws, Jim Crow segregation. So, and let's write real quick. So we my thing just went and I can't redo. Once I click out of that, that comes off. African Americans boldly declared to the rest of the country that their movement would be peaceful, organized, and determined. To modernize, getting a seat on a bus may not seem like a great feat. But in 1955, sitting down marked the first step in a revolution. And just remember, everything that begins, boys and girls, there's always a first step. It's never a grand step. Small steps lead to bigger steps and to a large platform. Okay? So let's look at some of these guiding questions. We had guided reading mode, but which identifies, and I'm looking in this section, the central idea of the text. Should we go with Rosa Parks' decision? So looking back, before we go on, I should really stop and look at some of the things that we highlighted. These weren't highlighted. Now I can highlight them. Everything that's underlined. Parks did not. So they became full. They had to give their seats to the white passengers. 3 riders did it, but Parks, that one person, did not. The bus driver was flustered for the reason that she was not following their laws, but he said he will arrest her, and she said, you may do that in a peaceful way. Going down, she used nonviolent resistance to social injustice, because this all is social injustice, the segregation. Because of this, it caught wind, and King and Ralph Abernathy organized boycotts. All they wanted was for the buses to become first come, first served basis, and white passengers sitting in the front to back and black passengers sitting in the back to front. Because of this, Montgomery officials wanted to sabotage everything, and they even bombed the homes of Dr. Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy, which I'm going to highlight right here. But despite of that, they persevered. And they only thought they would get 50%. 90% of the African Americans refused to ride the buses. So 90% of African Americans saw what was going on and said, we believe in this. We are going to support this. And they did it. And because of that, it hit the Montgomery buses very hard. They suffered thousands of dollars. So they didn't do anything violent. They were very nonviolent. They just didn't ride a bus. And because of that, it hit them financially. Then the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the MIA. They would rather, and that was something that, coming down here, King said, because they would rather walk in dignity than ride in humiliation. They would rather stand for beliefs than give in to something that violates their belief, and the Supreme Court ruled for them. Okay? In here, down here, this, we would have never have known. That one time, I will make this point again, Rosa Parks sat in that seat and just said no, sparked everyone else to do it, which sparked more movements, more boycotts across the country in different ways. It marked the first step in a revolution. So looking at all those things that we just said, all of those things have to come down to a major point that the author wanted us to know about Rosa Parks. Which statement identifies the central idea? Rosa Parks' decision to remain seated was the beginning of a peaceful protests in the South. Boycotts inspired Rosa Parks remain contained They didn't remain contained, the boycotts. They went all over the country. So far, A makes the most sense. Martin Luther King is ultimately responsible for the beginning of the civil rights movement. Was the whole text about this, every single detail? No. Rosa Parks did not intend to make a political or social statement when she refused to give up her seat on the bus. I would go with A because there were many, many details in this. Obviously, she did not intend to make a political or social statement, and this is a very true statement when she gave up her seat. However, the whole story talks about her decision began movements of peaceful protests. All right, ladies and gentlemen. So what we're going to do now after this is you are going into your reading day 1 slides. You are going to look at the background, watch the video of Rosa Parks. You're going to read, and this is an excerpt from the story that I just read to you. You are going to pull out, such as when did Rosa Parks refuse to give up her seat? It tells you when right here. It actually has it by section. So read each thing and you're going to pull out the details. Okay? Oh, apologize. So, after you read, in the beginning of this activity, you identified some qualities of a hero, which we're finding Rosa Parks to be. Based on what you've seen and read about Rosa Parks today, would you consider her a hero? Why or why not? After reading, are there qualities of a hero that you didn't consider earlier? Think about what Rosa Parks did for this, guys. Think about her manner and her demeanor in starting this whole revolution that she didn't even intend to start. She just said no. She has, use evidence from the text, and you will find evidence through everything you wrote in your green sections. Make sure you're using the Jane Schaefer format, TS, CD, CM, CM, transition, which is the T, CD, CM, CM, CS. Make sure your answer is thoughtful. It's supported with evidence that is quoted and embedded in the text. And your commentary really, really speaks to that evidence and really is in depth about what your understanding is. Thank you, everyone. Can't wait to see you tomorrow for our live meet at 3:10 and 3:17, beginning at 12, and 3:19 and 3:20, beginning at 1 with Mrs. Shaholsky and myself. So thank you very much.